They say that when you are truly broken, the pieces can never fit back together in the same way. What they don't tell you is that sometimes, the new shape is stronger than the old. They don't tell you that the fire that melts you down can also forge you into something unbreakable. If you have ever been told you are too old, too weak, too much of a burden, then you know the cold that settled in Agnes's bones that morning. But you must also know the fire that was about to be kindled. The paper he pushed across the table was a betrayal written in ink. Franklin, her stepson, with his father's eyes and a stranger's heart, didn't even have the decency to look at her as he explained it. The will was clear. The house, the land, the few coins her husband had squirreled away, it was all his now. She, at 70 years of age, was a loose thread to be snipped. An afterthought in the grand tapestry of his inheritance. "You have until sundown," he'd said, his voice as dry and brittle as autumn leaves. He spoke of a room for her at a boarding house in the next town, a charitable arrangement he'd made, a final duty performed. It was a place for forgotten women, a final waiting room before the grave. She looked at his hands, so smooth and unworked, resting on the polished wood of the table her own hands had oiled for 30 years. She saw the ghost of her husband in his posture, the same casual cruelty, the same assumption of her silent compliance. For 3 decades, she had been a fixture, a quiet presence that kept the hearth warm and the linens clean. Now, she was furniture to be disposed of. She did not argue. She did not weep. The time for tears had long passed, evaporated by years of quiet disappointments. Instead, a stillness descended upon her, a profound and heavy calm. She went to her room and packed a single satchel. A woolen shawl, a small knife her father had given her, a tin of matches, and a half-loaf of bread. She left behind the quilt she had stitched, the garden she had tended, the very scent of her life that clung to the walls. As she walked out the door, she did not look back. Franklin stood on the porch, a silhouette of impatience. He did not offer a word of farewell. The dust of the road puffed up around her worn boots with each slow, deliberate step. The sun began its descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a beautiful, mocking farewell. The cold was already seeping into her bones, a familiar ache that promised a night of misery. She was 70 years old, and she was walking into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart that had been hollowed out, leaving only the hard, unyielding shell. The path she took led away from the town, away from the so-called charity of her stepson. It led toward the old granite quarry, a great gaping wound in the earth that had been abandoned for a generation. It was a place of ghosts and sharp edges, a place people avoided. As dusk bled into a star-dusted night, the air grew teeth. The wind howled a mournful song across the lip of the chasm, a sound that seemed to pull the last vestiges of warmth from her body. She found a small outcrop of rock and huddled behind it, pulling the thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. The bread was dry in her mouth, each crumb a labor to swallow. This, she thought, was the end. A quiet, undignified fading on the edge of a forgotten hole in the ground. Her life had been a series of services to others, to her father, then to her husband, and by extension, to his son. She had been the silent support, the invisible foundation upon which their lives were built. And for her loyalty, her reward was this, to be discarded like a cracked plate. A memory flickered behind her eyes, hot and sharp. Her husband, years ago, laughing with his friends. Agnes? Oh, she's a sturdy one, but she has no grit. Needs a firm hand. The memory did not sting with old pain. Instead, it ignited a tiny, furious ember in the cold hollow of her chest. No grit. The words echoed in the wind. She looked at her hands, the knuckles swollen with age, the skin a roadmap of a life's work. She had buried her own parents, nursed her husband through the fever that nearly took him, had pulled more calves from their mothers than she could count. She had faced down drought and blizzard, sickness and sorrow. And he had called her weak. The ember glowed hotter. It was not hope, not yet. It was something harder, something more primal. It was defiance. She would not die here. She would not give Franklin the satisfaction of finding her bones picked clean by buzzards. She pushed herself to her feet, her joints screaming in protest. The cold was a physical blow, but the fire inside her was a shield. She began to walk again, not away from the quarry, but along its precipitous edge. Her eyes, accustomed to the dark, scanned the sheer rock face below. She wasn't looking for an escape. She was looking for a foothold. A place to endure. A place to prove them all wrong. The moon, a sliver of bone white, offered little illumination. She traced the quarry's rim, her boots scuffing loose scree that skittered into the darkness below. Every step was a negotiation between exhaustion and will. The wind tore at her shawl, trying to peel it from her grasp, a relentless bully. For hours, she walked, her body a single, throbbing ache. Her quest felt foolish, a final, desperate act of a dying animal. She was about to surrender, to simply lie down and let the cold take her, when she saw it. It wasn't much. A slight irregularity in the cliff face, a shadow deeper than the others, perhaps 50 feet below the rim. A place where the rock had been cut away to form a small ledge, barely visible. And on that ledge, tucked back against the granite wall, was the faint, angular outline of a structure. It was a line shack, she realized, a temporary shelter for the quarrymen of old, long since forgotten. It was a ruin. Part of the roof had caved in, and one wall seemed to be little more than a pile of rubble. It was derelict, abandoned, and utterly broken. Just like her. A treacherous path, more a goat trail than a walkway, snaked its way down the quarry side. With painstaking slowness, Agnes began her descent. Her fingers, numb with cold, scrabbled for purchase on the rough stone. Her ankles twisted. Her breath came in ragged, painful gasps. When she finally set foot on the ledge, she was trembling, not just from the cold, but from a terrifying, exhilarating surge of purpose. She approached the shack. The door hung from a single leather hinge. Inside, the wind moaned through the gaps in the stone walls. Moonlight streamed through the hole in the roof, illuminating a floor thick with dust, rockfall, and the debris of decades. It smelled of damp earth and decay. It was a tomb. But it was a tomb with walls. It was shelter. It was a beginning. She looked at the pile of fallen stones that had once been a wall, at the sturdy granite foundation that remained. She saw the immense, back-breaking labor it would take to make it habitable. The thought should have crushed her. Instead, it filled her with a strange and ferocious energy. Here, there was no one to call her weak. Here, her survival depended on nothing but the strength in her own two hands. The shack was a perfect mirror of her own existence, discarded, weathered, and broken down to its very foundation. But the foundation was still there. The stones, though scattered, were solid. That night, she did not sleep. She began to work. She started by clearing a small corner, stone by stone, her movements methodical and slow. Each rock she lifted and moved was a weight removed from her soul. The first week was a symphony of agony. Every muscle in her 70-year-old body screamed in protest. Her back felt as if it might snap, her knees burned with a fire that never went out, and her hands, accustomed to the soft work of the kitchen and garden, were rubbed raw within hours. Blisters formed, broke, and bled, leaving her palms sticky and tender. The work was brutal, monotonous, and unforgiving. Her days were governed by a simple, punishing rhythm. At dawn, she would make the perilous journey back up the path to find a seep of fresh water that trickled from the rock, collecting it in a rusted bucket she'd found amidst the debris. The rest of the day was spent on the wall. She would find a fallen stone, judge its shape and weight, and then, with a grunt that tore from her throat, heave it into place. She had no mortar at first, so she packed the gaps with smaller stones and hard-packed earth, creating a crude but effective barrier against the wind. Her mind, for the first time in years, was quiet. There was no room for sorrow or regret. There was only the stone. The weight of it in her arms, the rough texture against her skin, the satisfying thud as it settled into place. The physical exertion was so all-consuming that it burned away everything else, leaving only a core of pure, unadulterated will. She ate sparingly, foraging for edible roots and hardy greens that clung to life in the crevices of the quarry. She learned the patterns of the sun, where it would strike the rock face to offer a few precious moments of warmth. she learned the sounds of the quarry, the cry of a hawk circling overhead, the scuttling of lizards on the stone, the deep silence of the night. Her body began to change. The soft flesh of her arms and shoulders tightened into sinew. The skin on her hands thickened into a leathery callus, a tough armor forged by labor. She grew thinner, her face becoming a mask of sharp angles and deep-set eyes, but those eyes held a clarity and focus she hadn't possessed in decades. She was no longer a widow, a stepmother, a burden. She was a builder. A survivor. Each stone she placed was a word in a new story she was writing for herself. Each repaired section of wall was a testament to the grit her husband had claimed she lacked. The pain did not vanish, but it became a familiar companion, a constant reminder of her own strength and endurance. As autumn deepened, the colors of the landscape turning to rust and gold, the shack began to transform. It was no longer a ruin, but a refuge. She had rebuilt the collapsed wall, her stonework surprisingly tight and sturdy. She had scavenged fallen timbers from the upper woods, dragging them down the treacherous path one by one, and patched the gaping hole in the roof. Over the timbers, she laid thick layers of sod cut from the quarry's rim, creating a living roof that would insulate her from the coming winter's cold. The interior, once a chaotic mess, was now an ordered space. She had built a raised sleeping platform against the back wall, stuffing a mattress with dry grasses. In the center of the room, she constructed a hearth from flat stones and a chimney from a careful arrangement of smaller rocks and a clay and sand mortar of her own making. The first time she lit a fire in it, the smoke drew perfectly up the chimney, and a wave of profound, triumphant warmth filled the small space. It was the most satisfying moment of her life. She wept, then, for the first time since she'd left her old home. They were not tears of sorrow, but of overwhelming relief and pride. She had done this. She, the old woman who was good for nothing, had built a home from rubble with her own 2 hands. She crafted a simple stool, a small table. She found a discarded tin pot and learned to make a thin, nourishing stew from her foraged finds. Life was pared down to its absolute essentials: warmth, shelter, water, food. And in that simplicity, she found a freedom she had never known. She had not simply rebuilt a shack, she was rebuilding herself, stone by stubborn stone. The first snows of winter arrived, blanketing the quarry in a pristine, silent layer of white. The world outside her small stone cabin became hushed and still. The cold was a constant, pressing threat, a wolf at the door, but her little home was a fortress against it. The fire in her hearth never went out, and the thick stone walls, now chinked and sealed with her makeshift mortar, held the heat in a warm embrace. It was during these long, quiet days and even longer nights that the true nature of her transformation took hold. The physical labor had reshaped her body, but the solitude was reshaping her mind. In the silent house she had shared with her husband, the loneliness had been a crowded, noisy thing, filled with unspoken resentments and the ghosts of what could have been. Here, in the heart of the quarry, the loneliness was clean. It was vast and empty, like the winter sky, and within it, she found space to finally examine the pieces of her life. She thought of her husband, not with the dull ache of loss, but with a new, sharp clarity. She saw him for what he was, a man who had mistaken her quiet endurance for weakness, her service for subservience. He had never truly seen her. She had been a part of the landscape of his life, as unremarkable and as necessary as a well-worn chair. And Franklin, his son, was merely the final expression of that lifelong dismissal. The memory of his cold pronouncement no longer held the power to wound her. Instead, it fanned the flames of a slow-burning, righteous anger. It was an anger that did not consume her, but rather, fortified her. It was the heat that kept the winter's chill from her soul. It was the fuel that got her out of her warm bed each morning to check her smears or break the ice on her water bucket. She was not living out of spite. She was living for herself, finally and completely. She had spent a lifetime making herself smaller to fit into the spaces others had designated for her. Now, she was taking up all the space she needed. Her world was only the 10 paces of her cabin's floor, but in it, she was a queen. She had proven him wrong. She had proven them all wrong. And the most startling realization was that it no longer mattered what they thought. Their judgment was a distant echo from a world she no longer inhabited. Her vindication was not something she needed them to witness, it was in the warmth of her fire, the taste of her stew, the solid feel of the stone walls around her. She was 70 years old, and for the first time, she was entirely her own. 6 months to the day after she had walked away from her old life, she saw them. 2 figures on horseback, silhouetted against the pale winter sky at the quarry's rim. She recognized the rigid posture of one rider immediately, Franklin. The other was a slighter man, likely a town official, brought along to witness the legalities of her presumed demise. She felt no fear, no panic. Only a profound, weary calm. She had known, on some level, that this day would come. He would need to declare her dead to finalize his claim on the last of his father's estate. She watched from the narrow opening that served as her window as they dismounted, their movements stiff in the cold. They scanned the desolate landscape, their expressions a mixture of distaste and grim purpose. They were looking for a sign of her passing, a tattered piece of her shawl, perhaps, or bones scattered by scavengers. They would not find it. Agnes simply went back to her task, stirring the pot of thin rabbit stew simmering over her fire. The aroma, savory and warm, curled up from her chimney, a thin ribbon of grey smoke against the grey rock. It was a signal of life, an irrefutable fact. She heard their voices, carried on the wind, first confused, then incredulous. Then, she heard the crunch of boots on the snowy path leading down to her ledge. They were coming. She did not rush to the door. She did not hide. She simply took the stew off the fire, her movements unhurried. The door was pushed open without a knock. Franklin stood there, his face a mask of disbelief. The official peered over his shoulder, his mouth slightly agape. They saw not a ruin, but a home. They saw the neat hearth, the tidy sleeping platform, the smoke-stained but solid walls. And they saw her. She stood in the center of the room, a wooden spoon in her hand, her gaze level and unwavering. She was not the stooped, compliant woman he had dismissed. She was thinner, yes, and her face was a crosshatch of lines carved by sun and hardship. But she stood straighter than he had ever seen her, and her eyes, clear and bright in the firelight, held the ancient, unyielding strength of the granite that surrounded them. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Franklin's shock was curdling into something else, something ugly. He had come to bury a ghost, and he had found a fortress. "What is this?" Franklin finally managed to say, his voice tight with a rage that was born of pure astonishment. He gestured around the small, warm cabin, his hand trembling slightly. "What have you done?" Agnes did not answer immediately. She simply looked at him, her gaze taking in his fine wool coat, his clean-shaven face, his polished boots now scuffed with the quarry's dust. He was a creature from another world, a world she had left behind. He looked soft. He looked weak. "I live here," she said, her voice quiet but resonant in the small space. It was not the voice he remembered, it was lower, rougher, with a texture like stone. The official shifted uncomfortably behind him, a man clearly out of his depth. "You cannot live here," Franklin snapped, stepping fully inside, bringing the scent of the cold with him. "This is company land. It's derelict. It's dangerous. You are trespassing." He was trying to re-establish the old order, to use the language of law and ownership to put her back in her place. But the words were meaningless here. They were hollow sounds that bounced off the solid walls she had built. "The quarry gave me stone," she replied, her tone even. "The earth gave me a roof. The winter gives me water. They do not ask for payment." Her simple, elemental logic seemed to infuriate him further. He saw his carefully constructed narrative, the charitable son, the frail and failing stepmother, crumbling before his eyes. This was not a woman to be pitied. This was a woman who had rendered him, and everything he represented, utterly irrelevant. "You will leave," he commanded, his voice rising. "I will have you removed. For your own good, for my own good." For the first time, a flicker of something other than calm crossed her face. It was a bitter, knowing irony. "Your concern is 6 months late," Franklin the official finally spoke, his voice placatory. He's right. This isn't a safe place for a woman of your years. Agnes turned her steady gaze on the smaller man. I have never been safer with that. She turned back to her hearth, picked up a wooden bowl, and ladled a serving of the hot stew. She did not offer them any. The act was a clear and final dismissal. She was tending to her own life, a life they had no part in. Franklin stood there, sputtering, his threats turning to bluster. But he knew he had lost. There was no lawman who would drag this woman from the home she had clawed from the rock. There was no argument he could make that would hold more weight than the evidence of her survival that surrounded him. He was powerless here. He had come to close a chapter, but instead, he had been forced to read a story of resilience he could not comprehend. He turned and stormed out, the official scurrying after him. Agnes did not watch them go. She sat on her stool and began to eat. News of the old woman in the quarry spread through the nearby town like wildfire. It became a local legend, told in whispers at the general store and over fences. The story was simple but potent. The woman, cast out and left for dead, had not only survived the wilderness but had tamed a piece of it. She had built a home from nothing. At first, it was just curiosity that drew people to the quarry's edge. They would peer down, hoping to catch a glimpse of her, this ghost who had refused to die. Most saw nothing but the thin plume of smoke from her chimney. But some saw more. They saw a symbol of defiance. The first to make the journey down the treacherous path was a young woman named Mary, barely 20, with eyes that held an old sorrow. Her family had cast her out for refusing a marriage to a man twice her age. With nowhere to go and a spirit that refused to be broken, she sought out the one person she thought might understand. She arrived at Agnes's door, thin and shivering, not with cold, but with fear and exhaustion. Agnes opened the door, looked at the girl's desperate face, and saw a reflection of herself 6 months prior. She did not speak. She simply stepped aside, gesturing for the girl to enter the warmth of the cabin. She handed Mary a bowl of stew, and the two women sat in silence by the fire, a silent understanding passing between them. Mary stayed. She learned to haul water, to forage for roots, to mix the clay mortar. She learned the quiet rhythm of life in the quarry, and under Agnes's silent tutelage, the fear in her eyes was slowly replaced by a steady resolve. Soon after, a man named Thomas arrived. He was a laborer who had lost his arm in a mill accident and had been deemed useless by his former employer. He was a quiet man, accustomed to being overlooked. He offered to haul the heavier stones and chop what little wood could be found, his one good arm surprisingly strong. Agnes nodded her acceptance, and another place was made by the fire. The quarry was no longer a solitary refuge, it was becoming a sanctuary. A community of the discarded. They were the broken, the forgotten, the people who did not fit into the neat boxes of the world outside. They were drawn not by a promise of comfort, but by the example of a 70-year-old woman who had looked into the abyss and had chosen to build. They expanded the ledge, clearing more rock, and began to construct other small, sturdy shelters against the granite wall, using the same methods Agnes had perfected. The sound of hammers on stone now echoed in the quarry, a sound not of destruction, but of creation. A year passed. The single stone cabin was now the heart of a small, thriving settlement carved into the quarry wall. 3 other shelters stood beside it, their sod roofs greening in the spring sun, their chimneys breathing gentle streams of smoke into the morning air. A terraced garden, painstakingly built with soil hauled from the valley below, clung to the rock face, sprouting with hardy vegetables. The community numbered 7 now: Mary, Thomas, a family with 2 quiet children who had fled a life of debt, and a traveling preacher who had lost his faith in the church but found something akin to it in the quiet dignity of this place. They called themselves the Quarry folk. Agnes, now 71, sat on a stool outside her cabin door, her gnarled hands methodically shelling peas into a wooden bowl. She was the undisputed matriarch of this strange, resilient flock, though she never gave an order. Her authority came not from words, but from her sheer, undeniable presence. She had shown them the way. Her body was a testament to the life she had forged. It was bent and stiff, and her joints ached with the morning damp, but it was strong. Her spirit, once a flickering ember, now burned with the steady, radiant heat of a forge. She watched as Mary taught the children how to identify edible plants. She saw Thomas, his one arm corded with muscle, securing a new timber for another shelter. She heard the low murmur of conversation, the sound of laughter, a sound that had been absent from her life for so long. She had sought solitude and found community. She had sought survival and found a legacy. Franklin had never returned. Word was he had sold his father's property and moved east, eager to wash his hands of the town and the unsettling story of the stepmother who refused to vanish. He was a ghost in her past, a faded photograph from a life that no longer felt like her own. Her vindication was not in his defeat, but in the life that bloomed here, in this barren, rocky place. It was in the faces of the people who had found a home here, a place where their broken pieces were not seen as flaws, but as the very materials of their strength. The sun warmed her face, and she closed her eyes, listening to the sounds of her world. The chink of a trowel in the garden, the cry of a hawk overhead, the steady, rhythmic beat of a hammer on stone. It was the music of renewal. The music of a life rebuilt. And so, if you ever find yourself at the edge of a chasm, with the world you knew behind you and only emptiness ahead, remember the old woman in the quarry. Remember that the stones they used to cast you out can become the foundations of your fortress. You are stronger than you know. Your hands, no matter how old or how weary, can still build. And in the deepest silence, you might just find the beginning of a new and beautiful song. Now, go and find your own quarry. And start building.